So I know I'm a little late with this since it's been a couple weeks since the new expansion was revealed, but I've been thinking. One of the biggest changes to come out of the Wrath Classic reveal was that Blizzard is going to #make changes by removing the Looking for Dungeon tool that was first introduced in patch 3.3 back in 2009 when Wrath of the Lich King was the brand new expansion. In my reveal discussion video, I mentioned that I was actually on board with the fact that Blizzard were making changes, even if I didn't think it was going to be the change that the game actually needed. Overall, I was pretty neutral on the decision. Well, while I was on my way to the grocery store this week, I had a sudden urge to critically think about if this is actually a good decision or not. I came to the conclusion that this may be one of the more unnecessary, or maybe irrelevant changes that they could have implemented into the game. Regardless of my opinion on if it's a bad or good change, it just seems like Blizzard could have tried to address other problems instead, almost as if this was just low-hanging fruit that they think would have given them the most brownie points with the classic community. Like, what about trying to address the fact that all the leveling zones are dead? For those of you who aren't familiar with the Looking for Dungeon tool, it was a group finder UI that was specifically designed to bring dungeon diving players together regardless of their server. As you leveled up, you unlocked dungeons that you could then select from the menu and click Find Group. You were put into a queue, and when your group was ready, you would be teleported to the dungeon to join the others who were automatically grouped with you. You complete the dungeon, grab your loot, and then leave the group. You then teleport back to wherever you were in the world when you originally accepted the group invite and can immediately queue again. You are incentivized to use the dungeon tool through extra dungeon finder rewards and the fact that the dungeons themselves provided the best loot and the most XP per time spent in the game. On a surface level, this seems great, but over time, the problems started to show their ugly faces. Why go out and quest when you could spam dungeons from a city and power level to the new expansion content? Why worry about loot in the world when you could teleport to a dungeon and get the best loot in no time at all? Why talk to anyone around you when you could get automatically thrown into a group that has already completed the dungeon multiple times and therefore requires no communication to complete the content? It took a little while for these problems to really set in, but this was the start of a torrent of problems all related to quality of life systems that were implemented at the cost of players actually playing the game. The Looking for Dungeon tool, and later on the Looking for Raid tool, are seen by the WoW community as the start of exchanging gameplay for convenience. In my opinion, the original LFD and LFR tools were just too much. The tools could have actually been worthwhile if Blizzard hadn't made it too perfectly easy to use in place of actual gameplay. There were two reasons as to why Blizzard implemented the tool back in 2009 that stood out to me as something we should talk about in the context of Wrath Classic: the social aspect and the quality of life aspect. Let's talk social first. Originally, the LFD tool was introduced to solve a problem of low population servers where there weren't enough players to form dungeon groups. Tanks and healers were already hard to find, even on high population servers, but you can imagine it was probably worse when there were literally 25 people in your entire world. Honestly, this was a problem that needed to be fixed, and it still exists in Classic today, but there are problems that come with this fix. Regular dungeons in Vanilla and Burning Crusade were not that difficult. They took time and required you to be methodical in your thinking, but they didn't have a bunch of boss mechanics that you really needed to worry about. Most of it was just stand and hit and move when you're on fire. So in Classic, the appeal of dungeons was the loot reward and being able to complete content with others who had the same goal. There was a community feeling in that you are choosing your party to go off on an adventure. And back then, the adventure didn't start at the dungeon instance. There was preparation that needed to be done. You had to coordinate summons or figure out how to get to the dungeon area. There were attunements or quest lines that you could do beforehand. There was usually an entire dungeon before the dungeon, with groups of elite mobs that would keep you from even reaching the instance. All of this done with your party, since you couldn't actually do any of this on your own. And while some people argue that having to rely on others to complete content is bad game design, completely deleting these parts of the game should not have been the answer. Removing the gameplay reasons to communicate with your group just kills the motivation to try and talk to people at all. There is no more socializing if you don't have a reason to socialize. In retail right now, you would be extremely lucky if you were to find a dungeon group that actually talked, and most of the time there are no names used, just roles to identify people. Also, since you are probably grouped up with people on other servers, it's less likely for you to ever run into them again, which means that there was really no point in talking to them anyway. But that was in 2009. Let's flip this around because Classic Wrath is a different story. The game is in a different state than it was back then. In 2009, World of Warcraft was at its peak popularity. Yes, there were still dead servers, but there were still plenty of servers that were at peak capacity. Classic Burning Crusade still has plenty of people playing, but I think we can all agree that it's not the same number it was back in 2008. Classic also has a level boost, which has greatly reduced the importance of leveling and has made Azeroth a barren wasteland. So from a social perspective, what is Blizzard trying to save? The population issue is much more prevalent now than it was in 2009, and there really isn't a social leveling experience to save. And as for expansion content, it's still relatively harder to find tanks or healers because there are simply less people playing the game. So while the Looking for Group tool is good and LFG chat is always blowing up, usually all I see are players spamming messages looking for max level or heroic dungeon groups. That means that there is still a need for help finding groups doing all the other dungeons in the game. Now I will say this, joining an active guild will probably solve some of these problems, but leveling guilds are few and far between. between. Max level raiding guilds are still very active and might be willing to help you complete some expansion dungeons if you are a spec they are looking for on their raid team. If not, you are in the same boat as everyone else. So the looking for dungeon tool may as well be implemented because the harm to the community and its population has already been done. There are less downsides to implementing social destruction if there is no society to destroy. I don't think they should implement the full version of the LFD tool, but before we get to that, let's talk about the second aspect of the LFD tool that was a reason for its creation: quality of life improvement. One of the quote-unquote problems that Blizzard seems to think the game ultimately suffered from was the terrible amount of time it took to form a group in Classic.
Remember when you had to spam cities and say, need a tank, need a tank, need a tank during the Burning Crusade days? You don't remember that because now you just push a button that says go to the dungeon.
You had to spam messages in trade chat to look for a group, which only allowed you to spam these LFG messages to others in the same trade chat. Once you had your group, you had to spend the time to get everyone there, find your way to the dungeon entrance, clear through the elite mobs to get to the instance, and then get everyone ready to actually start the dungeon. So Blizzard thought it would be beneficial to take out all this prep work. If players wanted to complete a dungeon but didn't have an hour to do so, they could use the LFD tool to cut that time down to 15 minutes. The tool would form a group for you, teleport you to the dungeon, and give you a nice reward for taking the time to use its services. We already talked a bit about forming a group and how removing that aspect of the game utterly destroys the community, so let's focus on teleportation to the dungeon. Teleporting a player to anywhere is a clear break in game immersion, the only exception being portals or teleportation spells that mages have or are created in the world. These tie 2 points in the world together through magic, and it's a staple of the fantasy genre. The LFD tool is not that. What any teleportation does is remove a sense of distance, or in other words, a sense of travel from the world. If you can be in Stormwind, a major city, at the auction house trying to jump on the auctioneer stage and immediately get teleported to the Dead Mines 2 zones away, what point is there to all this area in between? The player has just lost any connection with Elwynn Forest and Westfall because they literally do not see it. Not only that, but players no longer have to clear the elite mobs that protect the entrance to the dungeon, so they don't even know where the instance is actually located in the world. If it wasn't for the in-game world map, some players may never know where these dungeons are. Not having players traveling across zones to get to dungeons or having any connection with these zones at all is extremely hurtful to the populations of the zones themselves, because any players left leveling in the world are now the only living souls around. Once they see that the optimal and more convenient way to play the game is to sit in a city and spam LFD, they'll also leave the zones, having this issue snowball until there is no one left. In 2009, the leveling world was still very much alive. There was still a large leveling community and new people coming to the game every day, so this quality of life improvement was much more detrimental to the game back then. In 2022, Classic's leveling population is already in a dire state. Blizzard have already introduced the level boost, which means the leveling experience is already barren. So again, I have to ask, what is Blizzard trying to save? Funny enough, I would kind of argue in their favor here. I actually don't think Blizzard should introduce the specific quality of life improvement of teleportation into the game. Just because there's a problem of dead zones right now in TBC Classic doesn't mean Blizz should just give up and make the problem worse. And this brings me to what I would propose as a solution. Now, I'm not Blizzard, so obviously none of this is tested or anything like that, but I would say that we need some sort of LFD tool in Classic. I just don't think we need the same LFD tool in Classic. I think Blizz should implement an auto group tool that connects people automatically, gives them their roles, and then leaves them to get to the dungeon on their own. Click your role, choose a dungeon from a drop-down menu, and the tool will automatically put you in a group with others. From there, it's up to the group to communicate on how to get to the dungeon, fight the elite mobs, get to the instance, and complete the content. Most people will already know how to kill all the bosses since this is our second time around in the content. If not, they can learn much easier by being grouped with people much faster. A second phase of the LFD tool can implement a way to deal with the server population issue, maybe phasing the player onto the same server as the rest of their group, or maybe one day Blizzard will get rid of servers altogether. If anything, at least give free transfers or merge servers or something so the dungeon fighter doesn't need to solve a low population server problem. There's more thought to be put into this obviously, and I don't know what their Classic engine is currently capable of. I just think there is a need to put more effort into this tool and not just outright delete it altogether. World of Warcraft Classic is not in the same place as its live counterpart from 2008, and Blizzard should start treating the game that way. If they really wanted to solve the issue of population or revitalize the world, they shouldn't have introduced the level boost in the first place. But this is just my opinion based on what my experience with Classic has been over the past year or so. I would be more interested to hear what you think. Do you think the LFD tool is fine as is, or do you think we can make a better one? Do you want it put back in the game once Wrath Classic releases, or would you rather see it stay out of the game entirely? Most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you are still kind of excited for either Wrath or Dragonflight, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.